Hey y'all, it's Stephen Van Kampen-Lewis, and today I want to take a deep dive into Cycnoches cooperi. In today's video, I'm going to do a couple of different things. First, I'm going to show you my blooming Cycnoches cooperi, which is over here. And then I'm going to do a quick update on the gigantic Cycnoches cooperi that I got from Peru Flora this past October at the Redland Orchid Festival. And it's doing really well. Its new growth is about this big, so its new growth which is very immature, might actually be almost the size of my mature growth on my young plant. So this new one is gigantic, and I'm really excited to see that bloom. Not going to happen this year. Maybe next year though. It is an import, so it'll take a little while for it to get used to the northern hemisphere, but I'll show you that right now. It's got some amazing roots coming out, and I'll let you know when I plan to start watering it. And spoiler alert, it's this big. The new growth is this big, and I'm still not even anywhere near considering watering it. And then I'm going to take a deep dive into the Cycnoches cooperi habitat, and then I'm going to take a deep dive into the Cycnoches cooperi habitat, so those of us out there who are growing this amazing species can have a kind of a better idea of where it comes from, and hopefully adapt our cultural conditions to try and match what happens in the wild for this particular species. So let's turn the camera around, check out two different plants of Cycnoches cooperi, one in bloom, one actively growing, and is an import from Peru. So I realized that the lights inside are way too bright to be filming under, and that I actually have a backyard I can film in again. So today is a really gray, overcast day, which is actually pretty good for filming the colors of orchids, believe it or not. So I figured I would move outside and show you the blooming Cycnoches here, and then of course the import over there. But let's start with the flowers. So this is even before the flowers, let's start with an update. This is one where the new growths decided to start way up on the side of the bulb, and so I leaned it over, sort of cut some notches into the side of the PET pot there, and let the two new growths grow directly into the media that way. And this has worked pretty well, although I would have preferred to see two blooms, one from each growth, but it is what it is. This plant didn't have a particularly good year. Whenever your Cycnoches are starting new growths way up on the bulb, that means they're stressed to begin with, typically during dormancy. So that didn't help. Then, as you can see by these terrible looking leaves, this got hit really hard by spider mites several times this year. And then it was growing in pretty shady conditions for a couple months at my last apartment. So when I saw a bloom spike coming out, I was pretty happy, even though I was hoping for more than one, of course, one for each one for each growth at least. But next year will be better with good conditions. Also of interest are the actual blooms. So most of the blooms that you're seeing in the Cycnoches cooperi on social media right now are coming from Fred Clark's breeding, and I believe this is from him as well, but these particular flowers are pretty starry. So the ones that we're seeing online, like the one that William Green showed recently, they've got really nice round sepals and petals, and there's very small windows between them. So they kind of create that more circular shape that so many people like. But the color on this, as you can see, is really nice. And actually, what I really, really like on this one is not so much the male flowers, but the female flowers that I got last year or the year before were just absolutely outstanding. Intensely bronze, sort of an orangey bronze color, and really nice. So I'm actually hoping that I get female flowers next year rather than male flowers. But it's a really interesting flower. So it's non-resupinate, which means that to our eyes it looks upside down, even though most orchids actually are non-resupinate. So what happens is when these are buds, they don't rotate, they stay as they are, whereas the typical Cattleya flower or so many of the other orchids that we have, you know, at some stage during their development, the buds actually flip upside down, and those are what our human eyes consider as normal, but in reality are not the norm. This type of flower with the lip on top and the male parts on the column here on the sort of bottom part of the flower, that's the typical habit for most orchids. So the lips are pretty ornate, as you can see. Kind of interesting little, let's see if I can zoom in here. Pretty interesting to look at. So what happens is the bee will land here. The weight of the bee will cause it to go down here, and then the pollinia will fire onto the back of the bee, typically scaring the bee into fleeing as quickly as possible and then going over to a female flower where the pollination actually occurs. So, you know, this is an okay example of a Cycnoches cooperi for the males. Modern breeding is much better. Good growing conditions will yield you plants that don't look terrible. In fact, after this, I'm just going to go and cut the leaves off of this one so that I can be done with them and not have to think how bad of a growing season I had for these guys. Next is the import. So this particular one, as you can see, actually let me turn the camera a bit here, is gigantic. You know, this tiny new little growth, which is not even mature, is pretty darn near the same size as the mature growths on this plant. You can see that the bulbs are very long, huge, and full of energy. So I'm not watering this one at all. I probably won't even think about watering for another month or so. You can see the roots are still just starting to really get going in earnest. As I look around, I don't see the new roots really getting too far into the media, so I will let that continue. But Cycnoches are not, they don't do well with very, very dry or low humidity. So what I'm doing is every now and then I'll add a little bit of pure water to this part of the media here so that I get water, a little bit of water sitting in the bottom here to provide a little extra humidity for the roots. Last year's root system is still fairly large. I didn't want to cut them off, and so I don't want the new roots to encounter water. I want them to search for water by going down into the media, and ideally the water down here will sort of pull or incentivize those roots to go down and seek more. So this one is doing really nicely. You can see the leaves are a little curled. That's pretty common for this group. And then once I start watering, these leaves will uncurl and unfurl and really start to get that nice flat shape that we're used to for Cycnoches and catasetums and whatnot. This one is getting blasted by a lot of light, so the tips here are a little light colored. Lots of sugar being pulled out, and that causes a lot of this, which is probably edema. If anyone has another explanation for what causes so many of our catasetums and Cycnoches leaves to have these bumps, let me know in the comments. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are. The best explanation that I'm aware of is that it's actually edema. And of course this one came from Peru Flora. I got it for $31, which I think is a steal for a plant this size, to be honest. So I'm very happy with this purchase, and I think it's doing pretty well. So that is the update on the import, and of course we have the blooms over here. Both are doing relatively well. This one could be doing better and will be doing better next year. So now let's take a deep dive into the natural habitat of this species and talk about what kind of conditions it encounters in the wild. All right, so rather than simply jumping into what I've done for other videos where I sort of zoom into Google Earth and then talk about the natural habitat, I figured I'd show you actually what I'm doing with some of the research that I'm doing, and how, which sites I'm doing, and kind of the sleuthing that happens when it comes to looking these up. So, I know I've been growing this group, the Catacetony group, for a pretty long time. So I've got a pretty good handle on a lot of their taxonomy and a lot where they grow. But like I said, I want to show you some interesting ways to do it, of how you can do your own research and look some of this stuff up as I talk to you about Cycnoches cooperi. So one of the things that I'll do is, of course, do a Google search and start looking into Cycnoches cooperi and care. And sometimes that takes me to this Trivaldo blog spot. And Trivaldo has a lot of different species. And so here what we can see is Cycnoches cooperi is native to Peru. This is a species from the Department of San Martin, and it's from humid tropical forests at about 500 meters. So we know that this is fairly low elevation, so we can assume that this will be fairly constant temperatures throughout the year. And then let's take a look at the Department of San Martin itself and do a little background on that, and see what that means, especially relative to the 500 meters. So the holotype for this species, or the first one that was found, is there in New York at the New York Botanical Gardens, and it's on JSTOR, and JSTOR is a great website. And so we see here that San Martin is in the northwestern part of Peru, in the province of Jujuy. And as I'm going through some of these locations, if anyone is familiar with them, please add comments in the comment section. I'd love to learn more about this. This is a little confusing for me in that, as you'll see in a second, San Martin is mentioned a couple of different times in a couple of different contexts. And so let's start with San Martin Province. So you can see that San Martin Province, of course, is there in Peru, and it's at that red section there. So it's sort of this smaller area within San Martin, but there's also a department of San Martin. And so the department of San Martin is San Martin, but bigger than this one. So it's almost like there's a San Martin within a San Martin. And so that's a little confusing for me, obviously, since I've never been there. I'm not sure what that means, but at the very least, it gets us to a place where we can start thinking about what the climate looks like, at least for that particular species, in terms of that first holotype was from that area. And so we can start thinking about the climate data. And of course, Moyomba is the capital of that particular San Martin, that larger San Martin region. And so you can see that, like I said, there's San Martin within San Martin. So again, it's a little confusing, but as you're going through these websites and doing your sleuthing, this is the kind of thing that you'll encounter, and you'll have to make a judgment call about what information is useful. Of course, this is that Jujuy area, and it appears to be in the larger San Martin area. I'm not really sure why that dot went away, but that's the area that we've been focusing on already. And what's interesting about this particular website is that it does show climate, right? So basically, throughout the year, the average temperature is 80 degrees all year long, right? And that average temperature ranges from basically 77 to 81, which is a pretty narrow range. And then if we look at the precipitation, there are a couple of months where it's dry, and then lots of months where it's pretty wet. But notice that those quote-unquote dry months of basically June, July, and August, they are not totally dry. There's still 2.5 inches that fall. So these guys are still getting at least some rainfall during their winter. Of course, it's the southern hemisphere, so June, July, and August are their most wintry months. And then prior to that is really the wettest part of the season, that sort of March, April time frame. So
So as we're thinking about climate, these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. We're thinking about that dry season. We're thinking about that wet season and exactly how dry and how wet those are, right? So Q is a great resource for plants in general. They're sort of the gatekeepers of all things taxonomy, and whenever a taxonomic entity or a species is changed, Q is, like I said, the gatekeeper. Now Q shows that Cycnoches cooperi is from Peru and northern Brazil. Now, obviously, it's not from that entire area. I mean, Peru alone has some very different ecosystems, but we're thinking about this sort of upper Amazon region stretching into the Brazilian Amazon, and not so much that coastal area, but this sort of interior jungle Amazon kind of place. And so now we're going to go to this next site. This is Hortus Orcus, and this is pretty interesting because this particular site shows Cycnoches cooperi, and they show climate information for Iquitos. Like I said, this is Hortus Orcus, and this is their Cycnoches cooperi page. And so as we're thinking about the climate information for Iquitos, we're again, I forgot. I want to show you where Iquitos is. Again, it's in that San Martin region. Well, maybe a little bit east. I think San Martin was a little bit west of there. So, but it's the same general area. Again, we're in the sort of upper reaches of the Amazon jungle. This whole northeastern, basically quadrant of Peru. So, what do we see here with this climate data as described by Hortus Orcus? So again, we're looking at pretty narrow temperature ranges. We're looking at high temperatures, maybe in the high 80s to low 90s, and then a fairly narrow band of temperature. Again, the average temperature appears here to be about 80 degrees. Low temperatures are in the mid to high 70s, and then we're going to see that the water, the rainfall, is pretty much what we saw on the last site, right? We've got a few dry months, and then we've got a few really wet months before it, but basically this one is getting rain all year round, even in the quote-unquote dry season of July, August, September. Now, what's really interesting is how narrow the humidity range is, right? I mean, look at this. This is basically ranging 96 to 93% humidity. This is a very narrow range of essentially saturated air all the time. These guys are not ever experiencing dry air. Also, something to notice is that the photo period there, essentially 12 hours a day, right? So we're not, 12 hours and 14 minutes is the longest day of the year, and then the shortest day of the year is 11 hours and 46 minutes. So there's pretty much a half an hour difference between those 2 days. So the maximum amount of sun change is not going to be huge for this species, at least in its native environment. We're really going to think about rainfall more than sunshine as a seasonal cue for this species. Although, those of us in the northern hemisphere, we're still going to have those sunshine day length changes as our primary cue for this group. So, but really focus on how humid this area is all the time. We're getting water all the time. We're in a really narrow range of temperatures all the time. And it's very warm and pretty wet all year round. So again, these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. And so let's take a little bit closer look at Iquitos. Excuse me. Let's start with San Martin actually on Google Earth. So type in San Martin and see where it takes us. San Martin, Peru, right? There's a couple different San Martins. So let's see what happens here. All right. So we're zooming into San Martin, and there's the Andes right there. West of the Andes is extremely dry. East of the Andes here is the Amazon, and so that San Martin department or province There's Moyomba. This is the area where the first Cycnoches cooperi specimen was collected. So let's kind of zoom in and see what we see. So of course we're looking at the Amazon River here. Like I said, the upper reaches of the Amazon River. But this is jungle, right? This is 500 meters elevation, and as we move east, it'll probably get lower. But ultimately, when we zoom in, we see these sort of big stretches of trees with these sort of open areas. And I don't know if these open areas are natural or human caused or what. Again, and if anybody has information on this, let me know. I'm curious to know exactly what those spaces are from. But so now let's check out Iquitos. Where is that? So we're using our magic machine to travel east towards Iquitos. And to be honest, from this elevation, that's the city there. But from this elevation, it looks fairly similar to what we were just looking at in San Martin, right? Maybe the elevation's a little lower. But again, we're in the upper reaches of the Amazon. There's lots of jungle here. I actually see less open space here, but basically it is trees and water for, as far as we can see. So again, as we're thinking about this species' natural habitat, even if as we move east, the Amazon is a huge, huge, huge ecosystem. And there's a lot of similarity from end to end in terms of the climate and the fact that it is covered with trees, with lots of water throughout, high humidity throughout the year, and of course moving east to west means that our sunshine gradient, our day lengths are pretty much the same, right? It's going to be 12 hours of sunlight all year round. So again, our seasonal cues will largely be dependent on water and rainfall. Well, at least in nature, as we're thinking about this in our growing conditions, we're still going to want to change the sunlight and use that as a seasonal cue for the Cycnoches cooperi, and then of course all the other plants that we're growing around them. I doubt any of us are going to be growing Cycnoches cooperi all by itself. So even if sunlight isn't a super important seasonal cue for this species, it'll probably be one for the other species that we're growing alongside them. So again, to recap, what we're going to be thinking about is these guys are from a fairly equatorial area. Again, high humidity, lots of rainfall, especially in the wetter parts of the year. Their roots really are not going to dry out. And so that's why the PET method is so important. This species and this genus grow a lot in rotting wood. So again, as it's raining every day during the rainy season, again, the roots are not going to dry out. There's no need for a wet-dry cycle during the growing season. Now, we'll want to keep them really humid throughout the year. In fact, I think that's a lot of where I've gone wrong in the past is letting them get bone dry. And then having low humidity. So from now on, I'm going to keep my humidity high, and I encourage you to do the same. Of course, we know these guys like very warm temperatures and lots of sunshine, and so really those are the keys to growing this particular species well. Anyway, have a great weekend. Bye.